Have you ever wondered if the papacy's historical timeline might align with biblical prophecy in ways most scholars overlook? Throughout centuries of church history, certain papal developments have coincided with prophetic timelines that seem too precise to be mere coincidence. While mainstream religious authorities rarely discuss these connections, the alignments between papal transitions and prophetic patterns raise profound questions about where we might stand in biblical history. Time is marked not merely by the ticking of seconds, but by the fulfillment of divine patterns established in Scripture. Ancient Christian saying, throughout Christian history, scholars have studied potential connections between papal developments and prophetic timelines found in Scripture. While these connections are interpreted differently across traditions, certain patterns have intrigued believers across denominations who study biblical chronology alongside church history. The foundation for these chronological connections begins with understanding biblical time patterns. Scripture frequently employs specific time frames that create prophetic templates: 40-year periods of testing, 70-year cycles of judgment and restoration, 490-year, 70 weeks of years, sequences marking significant developments in God's redemptive plan. These biblical time patterns establish frameworks through which some interpreters view subsequent historical developments, including papal history. Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks, Daniel 9:24-27, represents one of the most significant biblical time patterns. This prophecy outlined a 490-year timeline divided into specific segments, leading to significant events in Jewish and early Christian history. Some prophetic interpreters have applied similar mathematical principles to subsequent Christian history, noting how certain papal transitions aligned with these extended patterns. The year 1798 marked a particularly significant date in these chronological studies. Many scholars identify this as the culmination of the 1,260-year period mentioned in various forms in Revelation 11:3, 12:6, 13:5. Remarkably, this year saw Pope Pius VI captured by Napoleon's General Berthier, temporarily ending papal political power in a way that seemed to fulfill certain prophetic expectations about a wounded head of the beast, Revelation 3. Another significant chronological alignment occurred in 1929 with the Lateran Treaty between Mussolini's government and the Vatican, which restored papal sovereignty over Vatican City. This healing of the mortal wound appeared to some interpreters as fulfilling the prophetic expectation that the fatal wound had been healed. Revelation 13:12, occurring exactly 131 years after the 1798 events, a time frame some connect to biblical numerical patterns. The Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, represents another potential chronological milestone in these prophetic interpretations. Opening exactly 1,260 years after the rise of papal primacy under Pope Gregory I, 590-604, this council dramatically transformed Catholic engagement with both other Christian denominations and the modern world. The timing struck many prophecy students as significant, given the biblical emphasis on 1,260-day-year periods in apocalyptic literature. More recently, the remarkable papal transition of 2013, Benedict XVI's unprecedented resignation, followed by Francis's equally unprecedented selection as the first Jesuit pope and first from the Americas, occurred precisely 1700 years after the pivotal Edict of Milan, 313 CE, that legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. This timing led many chronological interpreters to see potential prophetic significance in this transition, especially given its historically unusual nature. What makes these chronological alignments particularly intriguing is their mathematical precision across centuries. While coincidence could explain individual correlations, the recurring pattern of papal milestones aligning with biblically significant timeframes suggests deeper connections that deserve thoughtful consideration rather than either uncritical acceptance or dismissive rejection. These chronological patterns extend beyond merely identifying coincidental dates to examining how papal developments have qualitatively aligned with prophetic expectations about religious authority in the last days. Jesus warned in Matthew 24:24 that false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect, a caution that some interpret as warning about religious authorities, claiming divine prerogatives beyond scriptural parameters. Catholic scholars naturally reject interpretations connecting papal chronology to potentially negative prophetic fulfillments, offering substantially different understandings of both the biblical texts and historical developments. Orthodox traditions similarly differ from Protestant apocalyptic interpretations, typically seeing revelation symbols as representing spiritual realities rather than specific historical institutions or chronologies. As we explore these chronological connections more deeply, we'll examine specific papal developments that appear to align with prophetic timelines, analyze the mathematical evidence for these correlations, and consider alternative understandings of these controversial chronological patterns. We'll also explore how these interpretations have influenced religious thought across centuries and what they might mean for our understanding of where we stand in prophetic history today. The historical development of interpretations connecting papal chronology to prophetic timelines reveals fascinating patterns that have influenced religious thought for centuries. These mathematical approaches to prophecy emerged gradually, gaining prominence during specific historical periods when religious and political developments seemed to align with biblical expectations. In the early church period, 1st through 4th centuries, prophetic interpretation focused primarily on the imminent return of Christ rather than extended historical timelines. Early Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian typically viewed apocalyptic texts as describing events that would unfold rapidly rather than over centuries. This imminent expectation shifted as Christianity's historical experience extended beyond the apostolic generation. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, interpretive approaches expanded. Augustine of Hippo developed an influential framework viewing church history as unfolding within broader prophetic patterns, though he cautioned against overly specific chronological calculations. This approach established foundations for understanding church history within divine timeframes while avoiding premature date-setting. Medieval interpretive traditions introduced more specific chronological frameworks. Joachim of Fiore, c. 1135–1202, developed an influential historical prophetic approach dividing history into 3 ages corresponding to the persons of the Trinity. His specific calculations regarding the transition between the age of the Son, identified with the institutional church, and the age of the Spirit, a more direct experience of divine guidance, introduced mathematical precision to prophetic interpretation that would influence subsequent approaches. The Protestant Reformation dramatically expanded chronological interpretations. Reformers increasingly identified the 1260-day-year prophecies of Daniel and Revelation with the period of papal dominance in Western Europe. Martin Luther initially showed restraint regarding specific timeframes, but subsequent Protestant scholars like Joseph Mead, 1586–1638, and Isaac Newton, 1642–1727, developed detailed chronological frameworks connecting biblical time periods to specific developments in church and papal history. The mathematical precision of these approaches intensified during the 18th and 19th centuries. Bible scholars from various Protestant traditions calculated that if the 1,260-year period began with Emperor Justinian's decree establishing papal primacy in 538 CE, it would culminate in 1798, precisely when Pope Pius VI was taken captive by Napoleon's forces. This remarkable alignment of mathematical calculation with historical events convinced many interpreters that the prophetic timeline was unfolding according to divine schedule. The year 1843-1844 marked another significant period in these chronological interpretations. William Miller and his followers calculated that the 2,300-day prophecy of Daniel 8:14 would culminate during this period, potentially marking Christ's return. While this specific expectation wasn't fulfilled as anticipated, the mathematical approach, comparing prophetic time periods with historical developments, continued, with attention shifting to identifying which prophetic events had occurred, rather than predicting precise dates for future fulfillments. The 20th century witnessed both continued development and significant reassessment of these chronological interpretations. The establishment of Vatican City as a sovereign state in 1929, exactly 131 years after the papal wound of 1798, seemed to fulfill expectations about the healing of the beast's wound in Revelation 13:3. This precise timing reinforced mathematical approaches to prophecy while shifting expectations from the papacy's permanent decline to its prophesied resurgence in influence. What makes these chronological approaches particularly significant is their mathematical precision across centuries. The consistent use of day-year principles, each prophetic day representing a literal year, created frameworks that aligned remarkably with actual historical developments in ways difficult to attribute to mere coincidence. While individual correlations might be explained by selective interpretation, the recurring pattern of prophetic timeframes matching pivotal moments in religious history suggested deeper connections. The specific prophetic timeframes most frequently connected to papal history deserve careful examination. The 1,260-day period, mentioned in various forms as 42 months or time, times, and half a time, in Revelation 11:2-3, 12:6, 12:14, and 13.5, became central to these chronological interpretations. When applied through the day-year principle, this created a 1,260-year time frame that many identified with the period of dominant papal influence in Western Europe. The mathematical precision extended to longer timeframes as well. Some interpreters noted that significant papal developments occurred at approximately 490-year intervals, 70 weeks of years, paralleling Daniel's prophecy. The transformation of papal authority under Gregory the Great, 596–04, occurred approximately 490 years after Christ's ministry. The dramatic shift in papal fortunes under Pius VI, 1798, occurred approximately 1,260 years after these Gregorian developments, creating nested mathematical patterns that further convinced many interpreters of divine orchestration within these time frames. Even papal transitions themselves sometimes displayed mathematical patterns connecting to biblical chronology. The period between Pius VI's capture, 1798, and Pius IX's loss of the Papal States, 1870, spanned 72 years, close to the biblically significant 70-year period of judgment and restoration. The period between this territorial loss and the Lateran Treaty restoring papal sovereignty, 1929, spanned approximately 60 years, resonating with biblical periods of completion and assessment. What distinguished these mathematical approaches from mere speculation was their grounding in specific textual references and historical developments. Rather than arbitrarily selecting dates, the most enduring chronological interpretations built upon clear biblical timeframes, 1,260 days, 2,300 evenings and mornings, 70 weeks, and identified historical developments that aligned with the prophetic descriptions associated with these periods. These chronological interpretations gained particular significance through their apparent predictive power. When scholars like George Bell, Edward King, and John Wesley independently calculated the 1,260-year period would end in the late 18th century, before Pope Pius VI's dramatic capture occurred, the subsequent fulfillment convinced many observers that these mathematical approaches genuinely unlocked prophetic mysteries rather than merely retrofitting explanations to events after they occurred. The 21st century has seen both continued attention to these chronological frameworks and increasing recognition of their interpretive complexities. While some traditions maintain confidence in the day-year approach to apocalyptic time periods, mainstream biblical scholarship has increasingly emphasized the importance of understanding apocalyptic literature within its original historical and literary context, rather than primarily as predictive timelines extending across centuries. As we examine these chronological connections more deeply in our next section, we'll analyze specific papal developments that appear to align with prophetic timelines, evaluate the mathematical evidence for these correlations, and consider alternative interpretations. We'll also explore how these chronological approaches might illuminate our understanding of where current events stand within the broader biblical narrative without falling into the trap of overly specific prediction or date setting. The specific papal developments that appear to align with prophetic timelines create some of the most compelling evidence for potential connections between papal history and biblical chronology. These alignments deserve careful examination to understand both their mathematical precision and their theological significance across different interpretive traditions. The year 538 CE represents a pivotal starting point in many chronological interpretations. During this period, Emperor Justinian's decree officially established the Bishop of Rome as head of all the holy churches, formalizing papal primacy in unprecedented ways. This imperial recognition dramatically transformed the papacy's authority, elevating it beyond purely spiritual leadership to include elements of political and legal authority across the former Western Roman Empire. What makes this date particularly significant is its precise relationship to subsequent developments. Exactly 1,260 years later, the timeframe repeatedly mentioned in Revelation, Pope Pius VI was taken captive by Napoleon's General Berthier in 1798, temporarily ending papal political sovereignty. This mathematical precision struck many interpreters as more than coincidental, especially given the biblical emphasis on this specific time frame in apocalyptic contexts. The nature of these events aligned with prophetic descriptions beyond mere dates. Revelation 13:3 mentions that one of the beast's heads seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The 1798 capture of the Pope, dissolution of the Papal States, and temporary abolition of the papacy as a political entity appeared to many interpreters as precisely fulfilling the fatal wound aspect of this prophecy. Remarkably, the healing aspect also aligned with mathematical precision. In 1929, exactly 131 years after the papal wound, the Lateran Treaty between Mussolini's government and the Vatican restored papal sovereignty over Vatican City. This development appeared to fulfill the prophetic expectation that the fatal wound had been healed, creating renewed global influence for the papacy beyond what seemed possible during the post-1798 period. This mathematical approach extends to broader patterns as well. The Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, transformed Catholic engagement with other religions and the modern world. This council began exactly 1,260 years after Pope Gregory I solidified papal authority in the early 600s, another remarkable chronological alignment with this biblically significant time frame. Even papal titles and doctrinal developments display mathematical connections to prophetic patterns. The formal declaration of papal infallibility in 1870 occurred precisely 1,260 years after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's recognition of papal primacy. The title Vicarius Filii Dei, Vicar of the Son of God, which some have historically associated with the papacy, contains letters with Roman numeral values that some calculate as totaling 666, the number identified with the beast in Revelation 13:18, though Catholic scholars dispute both this calculation and the significance of this title. The year 1798 holds particular significance across multiple prophetic interpretations. Beyond marking the end of the 1,260-year period from Justinian's decree, this date also aligns with the culmination of the 1,290-day prophecy in Daniel 12:11, when calculated from the Roman desecration of the Jerusalem Temple in 508 BCE. This dual fulfillment in a single year further convinced many interpreters of divine orchestration within these timeframes. Papal transitions themselves sometimes display mathematical patterns connecting to biblical chronology. The election of Pope Francis in 2013 occurred precisely 1,700 years after the pivotal Edict of Milan, 313 CE, that legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. His unprecedented status as both the first Jesuit pope and first from the Americas seemed to many observers to represent a significant transition in papal history that aligned with this chronologically significant anniversary. What strengthens these chronological connections is their integration with qualitative prophetic descriptions. Revelation 13:3-4 states that after the beast's wound was healed, the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast, and they worshipped the beast. The restored papal influence following the 1929 Lateran Treaty indeed saw remarkable global expansion, with diplomatic relations growing from a handful of nations to over 180 countries. Today, an influence far beyond what seemed possible during the post-1798 period of apparent decline. The prophetic expectation in Revelation 13:11-14 that the second beast would perform great signs has been connected by some interpreters to the various Marian apparitions and associated miracles that gained particular prominence following the papacy's wound and subsequent healing. The timing of major apparitions like Lourdes, 1858, and Fatima, 1917, within this period of papal transition, struck many observers as aligning with these prophetic descriptions. Catholic scholars naturally reject interpretations connecting papal chronology to potentially negative prophetic fulfillments, offering substantially different understandings of both the biblical texts and historical developments. The Catholic approach emphasizes reading Revelation within its historical context, as literature addressing the challenges faced by early Christians under Roman persecution, rather than as predictive of subsequent church developments. Eastern Orthodox traditions similarly differ from mathematical prophetic approaches, typically seeing Revelation's symbols as representing spiritual realities rather than specific historical institutions or chronologies. The Orthodox approach emphasizes the liturgical and mystical dimensions of Revelation, viewing its imagery as revealing eternal spiritual truths rather than temporal historical developments. Contemporary biblical scholarship across denominational boundaries has increasingly emphasized understanding apocalyptic literature within its original historical and literary context. This approach recognizes that apocalyptic texts primarily addressed immediate audiences using symbolic language common to Jewish apocalyptic tradition, a genre that typically employed cosmic imagery to represent current spiritual and political realities rather than necessarily providing detailed predictions of distant future events. Nevertheless, the mathematical precision of these chronological alignments continues to intrigue believers across traditions. While individual correlations might be attributed to coincidence or selective interpretation, the recurring pattern of biblically significant timeframes matching pivotal moments in religious history suggests connections worthy of thoughtful consideration rather than either uncritical acceptance or dismissive rejection. As we continue exploring these connections in our next section, we'll examine how these chronological approaches might illuminate our understanding of where current events stand within the broader biblical narrative, while maintaining appropriate humility about specific predictive applications. We'll also consider how different Christian traditions might find common ground in understanding prophetic literature's enduring spiritual message beyond particular institutional applications. The impact of chronological interpretations connecting papal history to prophetic timelines extends far beyond academic theological debates. These approaches have profoundly influenced religious movements, shaped denominational identities, and affected how many Christians understand both church history and contemporary events. During the Protestant Reformation, these chronological frameworks provided powerful motivation for challenging established church structures. When reformers came to view certain papal developments as potentially fulfilling apocalyptic warnings, this conviction gave them courage to stand against what was then Europe's dominant religious authority. Their understanding of living during a prophetically significant time created urgency that transformed religious conviction into decisive action. This chronological understanding spread throughout Protestant traditions, influencing how emerging denominations understood their relationship to historical Christianity. Many Protestant groups came to view themselves not as innovative breakaway movements, but as continuations of authentic Christianity that had maintained fidelity during a prophetically identified period of institutional compromise. The mathematical framework offered a comprehensive narrative explaining church history as unfolding according to divinely orchestrated patterns. These interpretations became embedded in numerous Protestant confessional documents and educational materials. Various Lutheran, Reformed, Baptist, and Methodist statements incorporated understandings of prophecy influenced by these chronological approaches. These theological foundations shaped how generations of believers understood both church history and their own denominational identities within a larger prophetic narrative. The influence extended to missionary movements as well. Protestant missions often incorporated these chronological frameworks into their understanding of global Christian expansion. Revelation's prophecy that this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Matthew 24:14 took on particular urgency when combined with mathematical approaches suggesting historical fulfillment of other prophetic markers. American religious history was particularly shaped by these chronological interpretations. Many early American Protestant groups viewed their separation from European ecclesiastical structures through apocalyptic lenses, understanding their movements as part of a prophetically scheduled restoration of authentic Christianity. The Great Awakening revivals frequently employed these chronological frameworks, with preachers like Jonathan Edwards interpreting contemporary spiritual developments within mathematically based prophetic timelines. The 19th century witnessed significant expansion of these interpretive traditions through movements like Adventism, which developed comprehensive prophetic timelines incorporating detailed mathematical calculations regarding apocalyptic timeframes. Groups emerging from these movements built denominational identities, partly around particular understandings of where history stood within biblical chronology. Catholic responses to these interpretations evolved over time. During the Counter-Reformation, Catholic scholars developed systematic refutations of Protestant chronological approaches to prophecy. Later, as ecumenical dialogue increased, Catholic approaches focused more on finding common ground through shared Christian affirmations, rather than directly addressing apocalyptic accusations based on mathematical interpretations. The Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, marked a significant shift in how Catholicism engaged these interpretations. Rather than merely rejecting Protestant apocalyptic frameworks, the Council emphasized reading Scripture within its historical cultural context while acknowledging legitimate diversity in interpretive approaches. This nuanced engagement created space for more constructive dialogue beyond merely competing chronological calculations. Modern scholarly approaches to revelation have transformed academic understanding across denominational boundaries. Contemporary biblical scholarship emphasizes reading apocalyptic literature within its first-century historical context, recognizing that these texts employed symbolic language familiar to original audiences to address immediate concerns while establishing broader spiritual principles rather than necessarily providing mathematical formulas for calculating future events. Nevertheless, historical chronological interpretations connecting time prophecies to papal developments remain influential in certain Protestant traditions. These approaches continue shaping how some believers understand both current events and future expectations, providing interpretive frameworks for evaluating global developments in light of prophetic timelines. What distinguishes responsible approaches to prophetic chronology from more speculative applications is their appropriate tentativeness regarding specific predictive claims. While historical alignments between biblical timeframes and papal developments may suggest meaningful patterns, biblical warnings against date-setting, Matthew 24:36, encourage appropriate humility about precise applications to future events. The continuing fascination with these chronological approaches reflects legitimate theological concerns about discerning God's activity within history. Throughout Scripture, believers are consistently encouraged to understand the times, 1 Chronicles 12:32, while avoiding both cynical dismissal of prophetic patterns and overconfident specificity regarding their fulfillment. Contemporary interfaith dialogue increasingly acknowledges that legitimate theological differences regarding prophetic interpretation need not prevent meaningful engagement across traditions. Many Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox scholars now seek common ground through shared Christian affirmations while respectfully addressing areas of continuing interpretive difference regarding apocalyptic texts. What emerges from studying these chronological traditions is recognition that apocalyptic literature serves purposes beyond merely identifying specific dates or institutions. Revelation's vivid symbolic imagery establishes enduring spiritual principles regarding faithful witness amid corrupting influences that transcend particular historical applications, while potentially finding recurring manifestations throughout history. This balanced understanding allows believers across traditions to take biblical prophecy seriously without necessarily maintaining specific chronological calculations that might hinder meaningful dialogue. The Scripture's enduring spiritual message about faithfulness amid challenging times transcends particular mathematical applications that have sometimes dominated interpretive traditions. As we move to our final section, we'll consider how these chronological approaches might illuminate our understanding of current global developments within a balanced biblical framework, maintaining prophetic awareness without falling into speculative excess. We'll also explore how believers across traditions might find common ground in prophecy's core spiritual messages beyond particular mathematical interpretations. As we consider how prophetic chronology might illuminate current events while maintaining biblical balance, several principles emerge that can guide believers across traditions. These approaches allow thoughtful engagement with prophetic patterns without falling into either dismissive skepticism or speculative extremes. First, biblical prophecy consistently emphasizes discernment rather than prediction as its primary purpose. Jesus instructed his followers to learn this lesson from the fig tree, Matthew 24:32, regarding recognizing prophetic seasons without claiming to know about that day or hour, Matthew 24:36. This balanced approach suggests viewing mathematical alignments between biblical timeframes and historical developments as potential patterns for discernment rather than precise predictive formulas. Throughout Scripture, prophetic understanding operates through pattern recognition rather than simplistic one-to-one correlations. Biblical history repeatedly demonstrates how prophecies often find multiple fulfillments across different historical contexts. Immediate applications for original audiences, intermediate manifestations throughout history, and ultimate fulfillment in culminating events. This multi-layered approach suggests viewing potential chronological alignments with papal history as potentially valid pattern recognition, without claiming exclusive or comprehensive fulfillment. The wisdom literature of Scripture particularly emphasizes humility regarding divine timing. Ecclesiastes 3:11 acknowledges that God has made everything beautiful in its time, while noting that humans cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. This scriptural perspective encourages appropriate tentativeness when interpreting chronological patterns, recognizing meaningful alignments while acknowledging the limitations of human understanding regarding divine purposes. For contemporary believers navigating these interpretive traditions, several balanced approaches emerge. First, historical alignments between biblical timeframes and papal developments may legitimately suggest meaningful patterns while requiring humility about their comprehensive significance or precise future applications. Second, these patterns can inform spiritual discernment without necessarily determining specific denominational allegiances. Third, prophetic chronology serves primarily to encourage faithful witness rather than merely satisfying speculative curiosity. What makes these chronological approaches potentially valuable for contemporary discernment is how they might illuminate broader patterns unfolding in our time. Current developments, like unprecedented technological connectivity, environmental challenges, economic integration, and interfaith dialogue, create conditions that align with biblical descriptions of culminating historical periods, potentially suggesting meaningful convergence with prophetic expectations regardless of specific calculations. The remarkable global developments since the late 18th century, precisely when many chronological interpretations identified pivotal prophetic transitions, deserve thoughtful consideration. The French Revolution's impacts on religious institutions, the unprecedented technological transformation through industrial and digital revolutions, and the dramatic reshaping of global power structures all emerged during this identified prophetic transition. Period. This convergence suggests at minimum that these chronological frameworks identified genuinely significant historical pivot points. For Catholic believers navigating these interpretive traditions, valid responses need not require either wholesale rejection of potential prophetic significance in papal history or acceptance of potentially negative interpretations of this significance. The Catholic emphasis on reading Scripture within tradition while remaining open to its continuing illumination offers pathways for acknowledging meaningful historical patterns while maintaining theological integrity regarding papal office. For Protestant believers influenced by historical chronological interpretations, thoughtful engagement requires distinguishing between legitimate pattern recognition and potentially oversimplified applications. The Protestant emphasis on Scripture's continuing relevance for all generations suggests taking prophetic chronology seriously while avoiding rigid systems that might hinder spiritual discernment for current challenges. For believers across traditions seeking deeper understanding, focusing on prophecy's core spiritual themes offers common ground beyond specific chronological calculations. The consistent biblical emphasis on faithful witness amid challenging circumstances, maintaining doctrinal integrity despite cultural pressure, and placing ultimate hope in divine rather than human solutions provides shared spiritual foundation despite denominational differences. Responsible contemporary approaches recognize that prophetic discernment applies to developments within all traditions rather than exclusively to any single institution. Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox communities alike face temptations toward the very patterns Scripture warns against: institutional self-preservation at truth's expense, accommodation to cultural pressures contrary to biblical teaching, and substitution of human tradition for divine authority. This balanced recognition avoids the interpretive trap of seeing prophetic warnings as applying exclusively to others while exempting one's own tradition from similar scrutiny. Authentic engagement with biblical prophecy requires examining how its warnings might apply within one's own religious community rather than using them merely to identify concerns elsewhere. The historical significance of potential chronological alignments between biblical timeframes and papal developments invites neither uncritical acceptance nor dismissive rejection, but thoughtful evaluation. The mathematical precision of certain alignments, like the exactly 1,260-year span between Justinian's decree and Pope Pius VI's capture, suggests patterns too remarkable for casual dismissal while still requiring interpretive humility rather than dogmatic certainty. Perhaps most importantly, biblical prophecy consistently emphasizes Christ's lordship over history rather than merely identifying concerning developments within it. Revelation's repeated vision of Christ, enthroned above all earthly powers, establishes divine sovereignty as prophecy's central message beyond particular chronological calculations. This Christocentric focus directs attention toward Jesus himself, rather than becoming distracted by preoccupation with mathematical formulas or institutional identification. For contemporary believers navigating these questions, several practical responses emerge from biblical wisdom. First, approach prophetic chronology with appropriate humility, recognizing both potential patterns and the limitations of human understanding regarding divine timelines. Second, evaluate specific developments against biblical standards rather than merely chronological calculations. Third, maintain both prophetic awareness and spiritual Charity, addressing concerns directly while avoiding unnecessarily divisive rhetoric. The true measure of prophetic understanding isn't found in mathematical precision, but in faithful witness. Revelation consistently portrays authentic believers as those who maintain testimony of Jesus. Revelation 12:17. Despite cultural opposition and institutional pressure. This emphasis suggests focusing primarily on positive faithfulness rather than chronological speculation as prophecy's ultimate purpose. Jesus' most sobering warning about prophetic discernment in Matthew 7:21-23 addressed those who claimed his name while not actually knowing him, a caution that applies across all traditions and redirects attention from identifying others to examining one's own spiritual authenticity. This scriptural priority suggests that genuine prophetic understanding produces transformational faithfulness rather than merely intellectual satisfaction regarding historical patterns. As believers consider potential chronological connections between biblical timeframes and papal history, the most faithful response involves neither uncritical acceptance nor dismissive rejection, but thoughtful engagement that honors both prophetic significance and interpretive humility. The balanced biblical approach recognizes meaningful patterns while acknowledging that we know in part and we prophesy in part, 1 Corinthians 13:9, until the perfect comes. Like, share, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on how believers can approach prophetic chronology responsibly while maintaining both biblical conviction and Christian charity. How do you see biblical timeframes potentially illuminating historical developments in church history? The proper study of prophecy leads neither to calendar-setting curiosity nor dismissive indifference, but to watchful faithfulness that recognizes divine patterns while acknowledging human limitations in fully comprehending them. Gordon Fee.